Welcome to Mr. Phantom, where fear hides in every shadow and chilling tales come to life. Before we start, make sure to subscribe and like this video to get a scary story every night. Tonight, let yourself relax, close your eyes, and sink into every word that drifts like a whisper between the shadows. Out there, beyond your window, the world keeps moving, but not everything that moves can be seen. Not everything that breathes is alive. This is the story of a man named Eric, of a house at the end of the street that seemed ordinary, but held something that should not exist, of a figure that walks in the silence of night, stepping soundlessly through a hallway that should have been empty. Take a deep breath and let this story guide you, because in the dark, something is always watching. I have lived in this old apartment complex for almost 3 years now. It's not a luxurious place, not even close. The walls are stained with years of neglect. The pipes creak whenever someone turns on the water, and the hallways are dimly lit by a series of flickering fluorescent bulbs that seem on the verge of giving out. But it's cheap, and in this economy, that's the only thing that really matters. My name is Eric, and I don't have much to complain about. At least, not until recently. I work as a freelance graphic designer, which means I spend most of my time indoors, glued to my laptop, drowning in endless revisions and tight deadlines. It's a lonely life, but I prefer it that way. People exhaust me. I don't have the energy for small talk or social gatherings. My neighbors? I hardly know them. I live on the second floor, apartment 2B. Across the hall is Mr. Thompson, an old man who keeps to himself. I've seen him a few times, usually when he's coming back from the grocery store with his worn-out canvas bag, or when he steps outside his apartment to pick up the newspaper. He never greets me, and I never greet him. It's an unspoken understanding between us, mutual indifference. The apartment complex itself is eerily quiet. Most of the units are either empty or occupied by people who, like me, prefer solitude. It's the kind of place where no one asks questions, where people disappear and no one notices. A transient space, as I like to call it. But then, something changed. It started about 2 weeks ago. I was up late, as usual, working on a project when I heard footsteps in the hallway. At first, I ignored it. People come and go, even in a quiet place like this. But then I noticed something strange. The footsteps were slow, deliberate, almost dragging. It was an odd sound, a shuffle followed by a thud, as if someone were struggling to walk. Curious, I got up from my desk and walked to my door. I hesitated for a moment before looking through the peephole. What I saw sent a cold shiver down my spine. A tall figure dressed in black was walking down the hallway. Their posture was rigid, their movements unnatural. The dim hallway lights cast long shadows on the walls, making the figure seem even more distorted. The strangest part, they weren't going anywhere. They would pace back and forth, up and down the hall, stopping every so often in front of Mr. Thompson's door before continuing again. I stood there, frozen, watching. There was something deeply unsettling about the way they moved. The dragging sound wasn't from their feet, I realized. It was from their clothes. A long, flowing black garment that scraped against the floor with every step. After what felt like an eternity, the figure finally stopped. They stood in front of Mr. Thompson's door for a long moment before turning their head ever so slightly. Just enough for me to see a hint of their face through the peephole. I gasped. Their skin was gray, almost lifeless, and their eyes hollow. Empty. I stumbled back from the door, heart hammering in my chest. I wasn't imagining this. Someone, or something, was outside. After a few minutes, I forced myself to check again. The hallway was empty. No sign of the figure. No sound. Just the dim, flickering lights and the eerie silence that followed. I tried to shake it off. Maybe I was just tired. Maybe my eyes were playing tricks on me. That was the logical explanation, right? But logic didn't stop the fear that crept into my bones. The next day, I told myself I wouldn't think about it anymore. It was nothing. I had a lot of work to do, and I couldn't afford to let my imagination get the best of me. I tried to act normal, even when I saw Mr. Thompson outside his apartment later that afternoon. I debated whether or not to say something. Maybe he had seen the figure too. Maybe it was someone he knew. But I didn't. I just watched as he picked up his newspaper with slow, deliberate movements, his old hands shaking slightly. Then he turned and went back inside, closing the door behind him without so much as a glance in my direction. That night, I told myself I wouldn't look. I wouldn't go to the door. I wouldn't check the hallway. I wouldn't even think about it. And yet, sometime around 2 a.m., I found myself wide awake, staring at my ceiling, listening. The footsteps were back. The same slow, dragging sound. Back and forth. Back and forth. A pause. A long silence. Then, the unmistakable sound of my doorknob rattling. I sat up in bed, heart slamming against my ribs. No. I wasn't imagining this. Someone was outside my door. I held my breath, straining to listen. The rattling stopped. Then footsteps, moving away from my door. Dragging. Thud. Dragging. Thud. I didn't move for a long time. I just sat there, gripping my sheets, every muscle in my body tense. I wanted to believe this was all some kind of mistake, but deep down, I knew the truth. Something unnatural was happening here. And it wasn't over. It was just the beginning. I barely slept that night. Every time I closed my eyes, I could hear it, the slow, deliberate footsteps outside my door, the faint rustling of fabric against the floor. Even after the noises stopped, my mind refused to rest. I kept replaying the moment the doorknob rattled, the way my breath had hitched in my throat, the sheer terror of knowing that something had been standing right outside. Morning came like a weak promise, the gray light filtering through my blinds doing little to shake off the fear clinging to my skin. I dragged myself out of bed and splashed cold water on my face, trying to convince myself that I was overreacting. I had to be. Maybe it was just a late-night wanderer. Maybe someone got lost or drunk or confused. There had to be a reasonable explanation. But deep down, I knew that wasn't true. I was still rattled when I stepped outside my apartment to check the hallway. It looked normal. Too normal. The same dim lighting, the same peeling wallpaper, the same stale air that always smelled faintly of dust and something old. There was no sign that anything had happened the night before. Then my eyes landed on Mr. Thompson's door. It was slightly ajar. I hesitated. Something about it felt wrong. Mr. Thompson wasn't the type to leave his door open, even a crack. Every time I had seen him come and go, he made sure to lock it behind him, sometimes even double-checking before walking away. I swallowed hard, debating whether I should knock. What if something had happened to him? What if he had fallen or gotten sick? The old man lived alone. If he needed help, there was no one else around to check on him. That's what finally convinced me. I took a deep breath and stepped forward, tapping lightly against the wood. "Mr. Thompson?" My voice came out quieter than I intended. Silence. I tried again, a little louder. "Mr. Thompson, are you okay?" Still nothing. A creeping unease settled in my gut. I nudged the door open just enough to peek inside. The first thing I noticed was the smell. It hit me like a physical force, thick and cloying, something between rot and mildew. I gagged. instinctively covering my nose with my sleeve. The apartment was dark, the curtains drawn so tightly that barely any light seeped in. The only illumination came from a dim lamp in the corner, its glow barely reaching the cluttered furniture. Everything inside looked untouched. Neat. Too neat. Like a preserved snapshot of someone's life, frozen in time. I stepped further in, my shoes creaking against the wooden floor. "Mr. Thompson?" No answer. I moved cautiously, my pulse thudding in my ears. My eyes swept over the room, taking in the details. The faded floral couch, the wooden coffee table stacked with old newspapers, the small TV set that looked like it hadn't been turned on in years. Then my gaze landed on the chair in the corner, and I felt my stomach drop. There was someone sitting there. For a brief, terrifying second, I thought it was Mr. Thompson. But then my brain caught up with what my eyes were seeing, and I realized, no, this wasn't right. The figure was too still, too rigid. A man dressed in black, hands resting on the armrests of the chair. His posture was unnaturally stiff, his head tilted slightly downward, as if he had fallen asleep mid-thought. And then I saw his face. Or rather, what was left of it. His skin was pale, almost waxy, stretched tight over sharp cheekbones. His lips were slightly parted, his expression eerily peaceful, except for the unnatural hollowness of his eyes. They were open, wide open, unblinking, dead. A choked gasp escaped my throat as I stumbled back, my heart pounding so hard it felt like it might burst out of my chest. This wasn't a person. It was a corpse, a long-dead corpse. My body screamed at me to run, to get the hell out of that apartment, but my legs felt rooted to the floor. My breathing turned shallow, my head spinning. Then, from the darkness of the hallway leading to the bedroom, something moved. A shadow. I wasn't alone. Before I could react, a familiar voice broke the silence. "You shouldn't have come in here." I nearly jumped out of my skin. Mr. Thompson stepped forward from the shadows, his face cast in eerie half-light. His expression was unreadable, his eyes dark and sunken. I opened my mouth to speak, to demand an explanation, but nothing came out. He turned his head slightly, his gaze drifting toward the dead man in the chair. "My brother," he murmured. The words sent ice down my spine. I blinked, unable to comprehend what I was hearing. "Why, you're your brother?" My voice barely worked. Mr. Thompson's lips pressed into a thin line. His expression was eerily calm. He never liked to be dirty, you know. "I clean him up every night. Make sure he looks nice." My stomach churned. My brain refused to process the meaning behind his words. Clean him up? Every night. I took a slow step back, suddenly realizing how dangerously close I was standing to him. My instincts screamed at me to get out, but my body refused to move. "I heard you last night." His voice was softer now, almost conversational. "You were watching, weren't you?" I opened my mouth, but he didn't wait for my response. He likes to walk. His gaze flicked toward the hallway, his lips curling into something that wasn't quite a smile. "That's why I take him out at night. It helps him, keeps him from getting restless." I couldn't breathe. He was serious. He actually believed this. That's not possible," I croaked. Mr. Thompson's expression darkened. "He's not dead." My blood ran cold. "He's just sick." His fingers twitched at his sides. "I take care of him. I make sure he's warm. I change his clothes. That's what family does, isn't it?" The smell in the room was suffocating. My chest tightened, my vision tunneling. I felt like I was standing on the edge of something terribly, terribly wrong, something I wasn't supposed to see. I needed to get out. Now, forcing my legs to move, I took another step back. I should go. Mr. Thompson didn't stop me. He just watched as I edged toward the door, his eyes dark and unreadable. But just as I reached the threshold, his voice followed me, low and cold. "You should be careful, Eric." I froze. "He likes you." I turned and bolted. I ran. My body moved on pure instinct, feet pounding against the wooden floor of the hallway as I shoved past the door and into the corridor. My mind was blank with terror, my breath coming in short, shallow gasps. The air in the apartment had been thick, suffocating, wrong. Every part of me screamed to get as far away as possible. The hallway stretched before me in dim, flickering light. The silence felt heavier now, pressing against my eardrums, as if the entire building was holding its breath. I didn't stop running until I reached my door, fumbling with my keys like a madman before finally shoving it open and slamming it shut behind me. I leaned against the door, heart racing so hard I could feel it in my throat. I squeezed my eyes shut, trying to calm my breathing, but all I could see was that thing sitting in the chair. A corpse. A dead man, dressed neatly in black, eyes open but unseeing. And Mr. Thompson, standing there in the dark, speaking about him as if he were still alive. The worst part, he thinks it's normal. I pressed my hands against my face, trying to erase the images burned into my mind. My fingers were trembling. "This isn't happening," I whispered. "This isn't real." But it was real. I had seen it. I had smelled the rot clinging to the air inside that apartment. And I had heard Mr. Thompson. He likes to walk. A chill crawled down my spine. I had seen it too, hadn't I? The tall figure in black that wandered the hallway every night, stopping at Mr. Thompson's door. I had dismissed it as some weird, unsettling coincidence. Maybe even a trick of my exhausted mind. But now I knew the truth. It wasn't a visitor. It wasn't some stranger passing through. It was him, the dead man in the chair. I shuddered violently, while rising in my throat. The logical part of my brain was screaming at me to call the police. Report this. This was insane. Illegal. But something held me back. What if they didn't believe me? What if they went inside that apartment and found nothing? The thought made my stomach twist. I had seen how empty that hallway looked in the morning, as if nothing had happened. What if it was the same inside? What if somehow Mr. Thompson had a way to make it all disappear? And what if the police did believe me, went in, and found him still sitting there? What then? What if he wasn't supposed to be disturbed? I shuddered, pushing the thought away. I needed to get out of here. Out of this damn building. I needed fresh air, needed to be somewhere normal, somewhere that didn't feel like it was pressing in on me. Grabbing my jacket, I practically ran down the stairs and out the front door of the complex, stepping into the cold night air. I inhaled deeply, my lungs burning. The world outside was so quiet, so painfully normal, that it felt like a slap in the face. Streetlights cast long shadows on the pavement. A few cars rolled lazily down the street, their headlights glowing in the darkness. Somewhere in the distance, I could hear the faint hum of life, the muffled laughter of strangers, the occasional bark of a dog. I stood there for a long time, just breathing. But even as I tried to convince myself I was safe, I couldn't shake the feeling that I was being watched. I turned, glancing back at the building. My eyes immediately locked onto the second-floor window of Mr. Thompson's apartment. The curtain was slightly parted, and behind it, a figure was standing there, tall, motionless, watching me. I couldn't see his face, but I knew it was him. I took a shaky step back, my entire body screaming at me to look away, run, do something, but I couldn't. My feet were glued to the pavement, my lungs frozen in my chest. Then, slowly, the curtain fell back into place. The window went dark. I turned and bolted. I didn't come back until morning. I spent the night at a cheap diner on the other side of town, drinking coffee I didn't even like, staring blankly at the tabletop as I tried to rationalize what was happening. The waitress kept glancing at me like she expected me to order something else, but I couldn't even think about food. By the time the sun finally began to rise, I felt numb, exhausted. I knew I couldn't avoid going home forever. My laptop was there, my wallet, my entire life. But the thought of stepping back into that apartment complex made my skin crawl. Still, I had to. So just after 7 a.m., I made my way back. The building looked the same as always, quiet, unassuming, like nothing had ever happened. My stomach churned as I pushed open the front door and climbed the stairs, heart hammering with every step. The hallway was empty. My door was still locked. And then I looked at Mr. Thompson's door. It was shut, completely closed, just as it had been before. No sign that it had ever been left open. I lingered for a moment, waiting, half expecting to hear something from the other side. But there was nothing, just silence. I forced myself to move, stepping quickly into my own apartment and locking the door behind me. For the rest of the day, I avoided thinking about it. I buried myself in work, headphones in, music blasting loud enough to drown out everything else. I convinced myself that if I just ignored it, if I pretended I had never seen anything, it would go away. But that night, I heard the footsteps again. Drag, thud, drag, thud. I turned off my music, my stomach twisting. They were slower this time, heavier. And then, the footsteps stopped, right outside my door. My breath hitched. I sat completely still, my entire body locked in place. I could feel it, the presence on the other side. The air in my apartment felt suddenly thicker, as if something was pressing against it. And then, the doorknob began to turn. Slowly, deliberately. I squeezed my eyes shut, praying that the lock would hold. The rattling continued for a long moment. Then, finally, silence. I didn't dare move, didn't dare breathe. And then from the hallway, a voice, soft, whispering, "I know you're in there." I stopped breathing. The words slithered through the crack beneath my door, chilling my blood. "I know you're in there." Soft, almost playful. But beneath the whisper was something wrong. A weight, a familiarity that made my skin prickle with dread. I pressed my back against the couch, hands gripping the fabric so tightly my knuckles ached. My heartbeat slammed against my ribs. No. I didn't want to believe it. I couldn't believe it, because I knew that voice. It was Mr. Thompson's. I swallowed hard, sweat slick on my palms. Maybe I was imagining it. Maybe I was so sleep-deprived that my brain was playing tricks on me. But then, the doorknob turned again, slow, methodical, like whoever was outside was testing the lock. Click, click, click. A whimper caught in my throat. I wanted to scream, wanted to run, but I was frozen in place, body locked in pure, animalistic fear. Then silence. For a long moment, I didn't move, didn't breathe. The only sound in my apartment was the distant hum of the refrigerator, the muffled tick of the clock above my desk. Maybe he left. I forced myself to move, crawling toward the door on shaking limbs. Every muscle in my body screamed at me to stop, but I needed to check. I needed to know. Slowly, I pressed my ear to the wood. Silence. Just as I began to exhale, something slammed against the door. I recoiled, biting down on a scream as the wood shook under the impact. Then came the breathing. Deep, ragged, wet, right on the other side. I clenched my jaw to keep from making a sound, tears pricking my eyes. The breathing continued for what felt like forever. Then a whisper. "He wants to see you." A sharp click filled the air. I nearly vomited, because I knew what that sound was. A key turning in the lock. I scrambled backward just as the knob began to twist, my mind spinning in blind panic. No, he couldn't have a key. But he did. I lunged toward the kitchen, heart slamming against my ribs. My mind screamed for a weapon, anything. But before I could reach the drawers, the door creaked open. My breath caught. The hallway was pitch black, and standing in the doorway was Mr. Thompson. He loomed in the shadows, half hidden by darkness. His face was eerily calm, eyes unreadable. He wasn't holding a weapon. He wasn't lunging at me. But the way he stared, like he was waiting for something, made my skin crawl. I tried to speak, but no sound came out. My throat had completely closed up. Mr. Thompson took a step inside. I backed away instinctively, hands trembling. Get out, I finally choked out. "I swear to God, I'll call the police." He didn't react, didn't blink, didn't breathe. He simply stood there, watching me with an expression so empty, so eerily serene, that it made my stomach twist. Then he whispered, "He wants to walk." Something moved behind him. A shadow. My body went rigid. I couldn't see it, couldn't make out a clear shape, but I felt it. Tall, wrong, lingering just beyond the doorway. Watching. Then it moved. A single, jerky step forward. The dim light from my apartment cast a sliver of illumination on the thing behind Mr. Thompson. And I saw it. The corpse. The same man I had seen sitting in that chair. The waxy, hollow face. The unnatural stillness. The black clothing, neatly pressed and buttoned. But it was moving, one slow step at a time, like a puppet with its strings barely holding together. I couldn't breathe, couldn't scream, couldn't do anything except stare in utter, incomprehensible terror as that thing, that corpse, stepped fully into my apartment. Mr. Thompson finally smiled. "You shouldn't have watched," he whispered. The dead man's head snapped toward me. I ran. I don't remember grabbing my keys. Don't remember the moment I tore through the apartment, shoving past Mr. Thompson and that thing as I bolted into the hallway. All I remember is the sound, a deep, sickening crack, like bone twisting the wrong way, as the corpse's neck turned toward me, following my movement too fast, too unnatural. I didn't look back, didn't stop. I sprinted down the stairs, nearly tripping over myself as I stumbled out the front door and into the freezing night air. The street was empty. No one to help me. No one to believe me. I forced myself to keep running, my own breath coming in ragged sobs. I didn't stop until I was halfway across the city, the looming shape of my apartment building far behind me. Only then did I finally collapse onto a bench, sucking in deep, desperate gulps of air. I grabbed my phone with shaking hands, my mind screaming at me to call the police. I dialed 911, pressing the phone to my ear. It rang once, twice, then static. I pulled the phone away, heart pounding. My screen was blank. The call had disconnected. A cold wave of dread washed over me. Something was wrong. Something was still watching. And then, in the distance, from the direction of my apartment, I heard footsteps. Slow, deliberate, coming closer. And a whisper carried through the wind, soft, distant, almost playful. "He wants to see you, Eric." I ran. I didn't know where I was going, but I knew I had to get away. My feet pounded against the cold pavement, my lungs burning, my heart jackhammering in my chest. The city lights blurred past me as I tore through the empty streets, the whisper still ringing in my ears. "He wants to see you, Eric." No. This wasn't happening. This couldn't be happening. I had left the apartment. I had gotten away. I should have been safe. But then why? Why did it feel like something was still chasing me? I threw a glance over my shoulder. The street behind me was empty, but the air felt wrong. The night had been cold before, but now the temperature had dropped into something inhumanly frigid. The wind whipped against my skin, but it wasn't just the cold that made me shiver. It was the feeling, like I wasn't alone, like something was right behind me, watching, waiting. I turned a corner, nearly colliding with a trash bin in my desperation. My hands hit the cold metal, steadying myself as I struggled to catch my breath. I needed to think. I needed a plan. I couldn't go back to my apartment. That place wasn't safe. But where could I go? Who the hell would believe me if I told them what I had seen? A corpse walking. Mr. Thompson, smiling like it was normal. I gritted my teeth. Maybe I was losing my mind. Maybe I had finally cracked under stress, and my brain was feeding me hallucinations. Maybe. But then, a footstep echoed in the distance. I stiffened, my breath catching in my throat. Another footstep, and another. Slow, deliberate, coming closer. No, I wasn't imagining this. I pressed my back against the wall of the alleyway, trying to make myself as small as possible. My heartbeat pounded in my ears. The footsteps grew louder. Then they stopped, right at the mouth of the alley. I clenched my teeth, forcing myself to stay still. A long, dreadful silence filled the space between us. Then, the whisper came again. Eric. I bit down on my tongue to keep from screaming. The voice was close. Too close. I knew that if I looked up, I would see something I wasn't supposed to see. I squeezed my eyes shut. The air grew heavy, pressing against my skin like a thick, invisible fog. My own breath sounded too loud, too sharp. And then, something moved. A shuffle, like feet dragging against the pavement. I clenched my fists, forcing myself to stay silent. Then, the breathing started. Ragged, wet, unnatural. I felt the bile rise in my throat. And then a single word. Walk. A chill ripped down my spine. I couldn't stay here. If I waited too long, if I hesitated, I knew that it would get closer. I forced my body to move, bursting out of the alleyway and into the open street. I didn't look back. I couldn't. I ran until my lungs burned, until my legs felt like they were about to collapse beneath me. I turned corner after corner, weaving through the dark streets, desperately trying to put as much distance as possible between myself and it. By the time I stopped, I was standing in front of a police station. My breath came in short, panicked gasps. My hands trembled as I reached for the door. They wouldn't believe me. They would think I was crazy. But I didn't care. I needed help. I needed someone, anyone, to tell me that I wasn't losing my mind. I shoved open the door and staggered inside, the warmth of the building washing over me. The fluorescent lights overhead flickered slightly, buzzing in the otherwise quiet lobby. A bored-looking officer sat behind the front desk, typing something on a computer. He barely glanced up as I approached, his expression uninterested. I swallowed hard. I need help. The officer finally looked up, raising an eyebrow. You okay, kid? I must have looked like a mess, sweat-drenched, out of breath, probably pale as a ghost. I licked my dry lips, trying to find the right words. My voice cracked. I cleared my throat, forcing myself to focus. My neighbor, Mr. Thompson. He has a corpse in his apartment. The officer frowned. A corpse? Yes. It's his brother, I think. He dresses him up every night and... I hesitated. How the hell was I supposed to explain the rest of it? That I had seen the corpse walk? That it had followed me? That something unnatural was happening? The officer sighed, rubbing his temples. All right, kid, you're gonna need to slow down. You're saying your neighbor has a dead body in his home. I nodded frantically. Yes, I saw it with my own eyes. The officer studied me for a long moment. Then he leaned forward, resting his arms on the desk. And how exactly do you know it's a corpse? I opened my mouth. Then I hesitated, because how could I explain it? How could I make him understand the wrongness of it? The way the skin had looked too pale, the way the limbs had moved like something that shouldn't be moving. The officer sighed again. All right, look, I can send someone over for a wellness check, but if this is some kind of prank, it's not. I nearly shouted. Please, just go there. You'll see what I saw. The officer stared at me for a long moment. Then finally, he picked up his radio. Dispatch, we have a possible welfare check at. Then he stopped. His eyes flickered past me, toward the entrance of the station. His face paled. My stomach dropped. I turned, and my breath caught in my throat. Through the glass doors of the station, standing motionless on the sidewalk, was Mr. Thompson, and beside him, tall, too tall, his brother, the corpse, standing perfectly still. Their heads were both slightly tilted, as if watching me. And then, through the glass, Mr. Thompson smiled, and slowly he raised his hand and knocked on the door. Knock, knock, knock. The sound sent a violent shudder down my spine. The station was dead silent. The air felt thick, suffocating. I could barely breathe as I stared at the two figures standing outside the glass doors. Mr. Thompson and his dead brother. Neither of them moved after that knock. They simply stood there, watching, waiting. The fluorescent lights overhead buzzed faintly, flickering slightly, casting eerie shadows across the station floor. I couldn't speak, couldn't move. The officer beside me, Officer Reynolds, I read on his badge, stood frozen in place, his fingers still clutching his radio. His mouth had fallen slightly open, his eyes wide in disbelief. He saw them too. I wasn't crazy. For a second, I thought, maybe I'm saved. Maybe now, someone else finally understands. Then Reynolds muttered under his breath, "What the hell?" Slowly, like he was afraid of what he might see, he stepped around the desk and moved toward the doors. I wanted to scream at him to stop, to tell him not to open it, but my tongue felt heavy, stuck to the roof of my mouth. Reynolds reached the door. His hand hovered over his gun, but he didn't draw it. He hesitated, staring at Mr. Thompson through the glass. "Sir," Reynolds said, his voice firm, but I could hear the nervous edge to it. "This station is closed for the night. If you have a complaint, you'll need to come back in the morning." Mr. Thompson didn't respond, didn't blink, didn't breathe. He just kept smiling. The corpse beside him remained eerily still, head tilted slightly, eyes empty. Then Mr. Thompson raised a single bony finger and pointed at me. Reynolds stiffened. "Sir, I need you to step away from the door." Nothing. No reaction. Then, the dead thing moved. It was barely a shift, just the slightest twitch of its head. Too fast, too sharp, unnatural. But I felt my stomach twist violently at the sight. It was real. It was real. Reynolds' breathing hitched. I saw his Adam's apple bob as he swallowed hard. His other hand instinctively went to his radio. "Dispatch, this is Officer Reynolds at the 7th Street station. I need immediate backup. Possible 10 to 91 situation," he said, his voice forced and steady. Two individuals outside refusing to comply. A burst of static crackled through his radio. Then, "He wants to walk." The voice slithered out from the speaker, wrong, distorted, like multiple voices whispering in unison. I choked on my breath. Reynolds took a step back, his eyes darting between the radio and the men outside. "This isn't funny," he snapped. "Who the hell is this?" The lights flickered again, longer this time, the whole station dimming for a few unbearable seconds before buzzing back to life. Outside, Mr. Thompson's smile widened. The corpse's lips twitched, almost like it was trying to mimic that same expression. And then, they stepped forward. I screamed. Reynolds finally reached for his gun, yanking it from his holster. I said, "Stay back," he barked. But they didn't listen, didn't stop. Their movements were too slow, too deliberate, but with every step they took, the feeling in my gut grew worse. Then, the door unlocked. Not from the inside, not from anything Reynolds had done. It just clicked open on its own. Reynolds barely had time to react before the door swung open, the air in the station instantly turning freezing cold. I gasped as my breath turned to mist in the air. And in the doorway, Mr. Thompson took a single step inside. The corpse followed. Reynolds fired. The gunshot rang through the station, deafening in the enclosed space. My ears rang, my pulse hammering. I saw the bullet hit, saw it tear into Mr. Thompson's shoulder. But he didn't react, didn't bleed, didn't flinch. He just kept smiling. Reynolds cursed, stumbling backward. He fired again, this time at the thing beside Mr. Thompson. The bullet went straight through it. It jerked slightly from the impact, but nothing. No blood, no wound, like the bullet had passed through air. Reynolds took another step back. His hands were shaking now. "What the fuck?" he whispered. I grabbed his arm, my voice raw with panic. "We have to go." He didn't hesitate. He turned on his heel, gripping my wrist as we bolted toward the back of the station. The air grew colder. The walls groaned. The overhead lights flickered wildly, plunging us into bursts of darkness. I heard footsteps behind us. Not running, not chasing, just walking. Steady, slow, like they knew we had nowhere to go. Reynolds yanked open a metal door, shoving me through before slamming it shut behind us. We were in a back hallway now, dimly lit, a single exit door at the far end. I didn't stop. I sprinted toward it, praying it wasn't locked. Reynolds followed close behind. Then he screamed. I turned just in time to see him being ripped backward. I barely caught a glimpse of pale fingers, impossibly long, curling around his ankle before he was dragged into the darkness. No! I lunged forward, but it was too late. The hallway behind him was empty. Reynolds was gone. A sob tore from my throat. I staggered backward, my whole body trembling violently. Then, a voice, right behind me. "He wants to walk, Eric." I didn't think, didn't hesitate. I threw myself against the exit door, bursting into the cold night air. The city stretched out in front of me, quiet and empty. I didn't stop running, didn't look back. I knew, if I did, I would see him. Mr. Thompson, and the thing wearing his brother's skin. And next time, I wouldn't be fast enough. I ran. I ran until my lungs burned, until my legs ached, until the distant glow of the police station had disappeared behind me. The city was quiet, too quiet. No cars, no people, just the distant hum of flickering streetlights and the rhythmic slap of my footsteps against the pavement. I didn't know where I was going. I didn't care. I just had to get away. But the further I ran, the colder it got. That unnatural, bone-deep chill clung to my skin, sinking into my bones like frostbite. My breath came out in thick, white clouds, my fingers trembling even though I was sweating. And then, the whisper came again. Eric. I whirled around. Nothing. The street behind me was empty. But I felt it. Something was watching me. The shadows felt thicker, stretching unnaturally against the pavement. The streetlights buzzed and flickered, casting everything in a sickly yellow glow. I was not alone. I swallowed hard, my heartbeat thundering in my ears. I needed to find shelter. Somewhere. Anywhere. That was when I saw it. Up ahead, standing at the end of the street. Mr. Thompson's house. My stomach dropped. No, I wasn't here. I couldn't be here. I had run in the opposite direction. I had left the neighborhood completely. There was no way I had ended up back. And yet there it was. The house. The windows were dark. The front door was slightly ajar, swinging gently in the breeze. Waiting. Inviting. A lump formed in my throat. I took a slow step back. I needed to turn around. I needed to leave. But as I did, something shifted. A figure stood on the porch. Tall. Too tall. Draped in black. Motionless. It was him. The dead thing. Mr. Thompson's brother. My body locked up. Every muscle screamed at me to run, but I was frozen. The figure didn't move. Didn't blink. Then, it took a step forward. I choked on my breath. Then another step. And another. Slow. Deliberate. Walking toward me. I backed away, my legs trembling violently. My vision swam. This wasn't real. This couldn't be real. The house shouldn't be here. I had escaped. I had. A cold breath ghosted against my ear. He wants to walk, Eric. I screamed. I ran toward the house. I don't know why. Maybe because it was the only place left to go. Maybe because some part of me knew I had to end this. The door was still open. I barreled inside, my shoulders slamming against the wood as I forced my way in. The second I was inside, the door slammed shut behind me, as if the house had been waiting for me to return. The air inside was thick, stagnant. The stench of decay clung to the walls, curling in my lungs. The house was silent, but I wasn't alone. I could feel it. Something was here. Slowly, my eyes adjusted to the darkness. The furniture was exactly the same as before. The same rotting couch, the same old TV set, the same peeling wallpaper. But something felt off. The air shifted. The hallway leading to the back of the house was darker than it should have been, like the shadows had thickened into something more. Something alive. And then footsteps, coming from the hallway. My breath hitched. I took a step back, my fingers brushing against the wall as I tried to steady myself. The footsteps grew louder. Then, a voice. Eric. I whipped around, and Mr. Thompson was standing in the living room, smiling, waiting. His eyes gleamed in the darkness, empty and unreadable. I knew you'd come back, he said, his voice light, casual, like we were old friends. I swallowed thickly. My throat was dry. I didn't mean to. I was trying to. He chuckled. It's all right. It's all right, Eric. He took a step closer. I flinched. His smile widened. You see, I knew you'd understand. That's why I let you see him. You're special, Eric. You know that, don't you? I shook my head, my chest tightening. I don't understand anything. But you do. His voice was soothing, like a parent speaking to a child. You saw him. You heard him. That means he chose you. A shudder rippled through me. I took another step back, my shoulders hitting the wall. I don't want this. But he does. I stiffened. The air grew heavier. The shadows shifted. And then, the hallway darkened further. Something moved inside. Slow. Dragging. A leg emerged first. Then an arm. Then, the tall, thin shape of Mr. Thompson's brother. His movements were jerky, unnatural, like a marionette being pulled by invisible strings. His head lolled slightly to the side, his hollow eyes locked onto mine. And he was smiling, not with his mouth, with his entire face. A horrible, stretched, inhuman expression. "See," Mr. Thompson whispered beside me. "He likes you." My stomach churned. My hands shook. And then, the dead thing walked toward me. I bolted. I tore through the house, my heartbeat pounding in my ears. I didn't know where I was going. Didn't care. I just had to get away. I reached the stairs, my foot hitting the first step. Then a cold, bony hand clamped around my wrist. I screamed, whipping around, but there was nothing there. No one. Yet the pressure remained, fingers digging into my skin like an invisible grip. Then, a voice. "Walk." A sob tore from my throat. I wrenched my arm free, stumbling up the stairs. My vision blurred with panic as I ran down the narrow hallway, shoving open the first door I saw. A bedroom. Small. Empty. But before I could react, before I could move, the door slammed shut behind me, and the lock clicked. I turned, my breath heaving. I reached for the doorknob, yanking at it desperately, but it wouldn't budge. Then, a sound from behind me. Slow, uneven, a wet, rasping breath. I didn't want to turn around. I didn't want to see, but something compelled me to. And when I did, a figure was standing in the far corner of the room. Tall, draped in black, head tilted. And then, it took a step forward. I couldn't move. The thing in the corner stood motionless, its body swallowed in shadows, yet I could feel its eyes locked onto me. That same horrific, stretched-out grin still twisted across its decayed face, as if it was mocking my fear. I tried to scream. Nothing came out. The air in the room felt thick, suffocating. My vision blurred as the walls seemed to stretch, the corners darkening, swallowing the little light that remained. Then, it took another step forward, and another. A choked sob clawed its way up my throat as I pressed against the door, yanking at the knob in blind panic. My hands were slick with sweat, fingers trembling. Open, damn it. Open. But the door wouldn't budge. The room around me warped, the air growing colder. My breath curled in white mist as the temperature plummeted. Behind me, it moved again. Closer. I felt the floorboards groan under its weight. The sickly stench of rot curled into my lungs, thick and putrid, making my stomach churn violently. I couldn't look. I wouldn't look. But my body didn't listen. My head turned, against my will. And I saw it. Right behind me. The tall, lanky frame loomed over me, its face impossibly stretched, skin too pale, too tight over its skull. Its dark, hollow eyes bored into mine, empty yet filled with something hungry. A bony, decayed hand lifted, and touched my face. Cold. It was so cold. Like death itself. And then, a voice. "He wants to walk, Eric." Mr. Thompson's voice. I snapped. With a scream, I lashed out, swinging my arms wildly. My fist connected with nothing, but the force of my movement sent me stumbling backward. The door, it was open. I didn't question it. I ran. I tore out of the room, slamming into the hallway wall before bolting down the stairs. My vision blurred, my heart hammering so violently it felt like it might burst out of my chest. Somewhere behind me, the footsteps followed. Slow, deliberate, that same horrible, dragging gait. But I didn't look back. I hit the bottom of the stairs, barely catching myself before lunging toward the front door. It was open. I didn't think. I ran out into the night. The cold air hit me like a punch to the lungs, but I kept running, my body on pure adrenaline. The neighborhood was eerily silent. No streetlights. No sounds of the city. Nothing. Like the entire world had vanished. I turned onto the sidewalk, my legs nearly giving out beneath me. My breath came in ragged gasps, my vision dark at the edges. I needed to keep moving. I needed to. A hand clamped onto my shoulder. I screamed. I swung around, arms flailing, and stopped. It was Reynolds, the officer from the station. But he was dead. I saw him get dragged away. Yet here he was, standing before me. His uniform was pristine, his skin pale, but there was something wrong with his eyes. They were too dark, too empty, like Mr. Thompson's, like his brother's. "Eric," he said softly, that too familiar smile curling across his lips. "Why are you running?" My blood turned ice cold. I stumbled back, shaking my head violently. No, this isn't real, you're dead." Reynolds' smile didn't falter. "But you saw me, didn't you?" His voice was light, almost teasing. "You heard me. That means I chose you." The exact same words Mr. Thompson had said. I whirled around to run, and slammed into something solid. Mr. Thompson, standing right behind me. His cold, bony fingers wrapped around my arm before I could react, holding me in place. His grin was wider than ever. "You understand now, don't you, Eric?" His voice was gentle, almost affectionate. "You see, it's not about me. It's about him." My breath hitched. My body locked up as something moved behind Mr. Thompson. The dead thing. His brother. He was standing right there, towering over both of us, staring directly at me. Mr. Thompson's grip tightened on my arm. "He likes you, Eric," he whispered. "And you know what that means, don't you?" My pulse roared in my ears. My chest heaved violently. And then, the dead thing moved. It stepped forward, its head tilting. Its mouth twitched, stretching into an unnatural, jagged grin. It reached out and pressed its fingers to my forehead. A cold shock tore through me, like ice water had been poured directly into my veins. I couldn't breathe, couldn't move. My vision blurred. Everything around me warped. And suddenly, I was standing in front of my own house. I gasped, staggering backward. My chest ached. My skin felt wrong. The streetlights were back. The city noises had returned. It was as if nothing had ever happened. I was back. I was safe. But something was wrong. I lifted my hands, staring at them. My fingers shook violently. My skin was pale. Too pale. A chill ran down my spine. Slowly, hesitantly, I turned toward the house across the street. Mr. Thompson's house. The lights inside were on. The door was closed. Like everything was normal. But in the upstairs window, a figure stood watching me. Tall, draped in black, and smiling. Then, it lifted a single finger and pointed at me. A cold realization settled into my bones. I opened my mouth, but before I could scream, before I could even breathe, the streetlight above me flickered. And then, everything went dark. And so, the night continues. The world outside remains quiet. But now you know, some things walk even when they shouldn't. Perhaps, as you lie there in the stillness, you'll start to notice the little sounds you usually ignore. The faint creak of the floorboards, the soft rustle in the hallway. The feeling that maybe, just maybe, you're not as alone as you think. But for now, let your eyes grow heavy. Let the darkness wrap around you and drift into sleep. Before you go, tell me, have you ever had an experience with something you couldn't explain? A shadow in the corner of your eye? A whisper in an empty room? Share your thoughts in the comments. I'd love to hear them. Sleep well, and remember, if you hear footsteps in the night, it's probably just your imagination. Probably.